My name is Sara Quesada. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English, and I want to thank you all for coming. I also want to thank the various units that were involved in making this lecture possible. So the Institute for Scholarship and Liberal Arts for their generous grant, the American Area Seminar in the English Department, thank you, Matt Wilkins, the Institute for Latino Studies, thank you so much, Lali and Mari, and of course our director, Professor Luis Fraga, and the Kellogg Institute through the Latin American History Working Group directed by Karen Grobart. Many thanks as well. As you can see, there were a lot of participants involved in the much anticipated welcoming of our distinguished guest today, who I also want to thank for getting on a really early flight this morning to join us, so thank you to you as well. Well, few times does one have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing such a distinguished scholar in our field, and that is, of course, Dr. Maria Josefina Saldana-Portillo. It is impossible to sum up all of her accomplishments in just a matter of minutes here in my introduction, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. Professor Saldana-Portillo is a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU, where she has taught since 2006. She is now a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and she and I share the fact that we both got our PhDs at Stanford, and since she has held academic positions at Rutgers, Brown, UC Santa Barbara, among other places. Professor Saldana teaches and researches in transnational and hemispheric Latino and Latin American cultural studies, literature, and film, as well as studies of indigeneity, comparative race, immigration, and globalization. Now, I remember the day distinctly that I came across Josie Saldana's work as the moment in which a key to my transatlantic project earnestly came in to focus. In an edited volume by Juan Flores and Renato Rosaldo's A Companion to Latino Studies, early on, Saldana called for a truly nuanced, transnational approach to Latino studies, moving beyond the nation as a unit precisely because, she stated, Latino and Latina identities begin to form not in the US, but in Latin America, as an effect of US intervention and compulsory neoliberalism. To think about Americanity thus means thinking beyond our delimited borders politically, racially, ethnically, linguistically, and spatially. How far can this US hegemony travel, and what are the spatial consequences of its impact today? Her now famous book addresses this comparative spatial and racial analysis in Indian Given, Racial Geographies Across Mexico and the United States. In this book, Saldana explains that the national geographies are supremely racial, mutually constituted and imbricated, and that we cannot understand them without the colonial modes that created them. Indian Given, the subject of today's presentation, is a book that has won her numerous prestigious awards, such as the American Studies Association's John Hope Franklin Prize for Best Book, as well as the Best Book Award from the National Association for Chicano and Chicana Studies. And this book, by the way, is available for book signing, so stick around for our reception afterwards. She has also published The Revolutionary Imagination in the Americas and the Age of Development, also with Duke University Press, and she is a co-editor of Desposesión, Género, Territorio y Luchas por la Autodeterminación, as well as Aunt Lut's Anthology of US Women's Writing. And of course, she has published widely, challenging the borders and boundaries of studies in US imperialism, race, and indigeneity. She's a recipient of numerous academic awards, notably from the US Fulbright, the NEH, the Ford, and the Mellon Foundation, and she's also chaired various committees at the MLA, the Tepoztlan Institute, American Studies Association, and the ACLS Mellon Foundation. So again, it is an honor to welcome a scholar that has spearheaded a transnational drift, as she calls it, within indigeneity, but also in American culture more broadly. So for that, we thank you and we warmly welcome you to Notre Dame. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Saldana-Portillo.
Thank you, Sara. That was embarrassingly kind. And I also want to thank History and English and the Latino Studies Institute and the Kellogg's Institute, and you as well for being here, for bringing me, and then you here for being here. So heads will roll, US-Mexico Circuits of Drug Violence. On May 2nd, 2011, US Navy SEAL Team 6 killed Osama bin Laden during a raid on his family compound in Pakistan. The SEAL team leader informed President Obama about the success of the mission with the phrase, "For God and country, Geronimo, Geronimo, Geronimo." It remains unclear whether Geronimo was shorthand for the mission, for bin Laden, or for the act of killing bin Laden. What is clear is that the name Geronimo linked bin Laden's evasion of the US military and intelligence community for almost 10 years at the beginning of the 21st century, with the Apache leader's evasion of US and Mexican militaries for over 10 years at the end of the 19th. Oh, thank you. Though separated by more than a century of US global warfare, this speech act linking a Christian God to our nation also linked the Muslim and the Native American as terrorists. Osama and Geronimo were savvy and resourceful, perhaps even brave, but ultimately they were linked as terrorists who were beaten into the country's military memory and popular imagination. Just a few days later, on May 9th, 2011, tens of thousands of Mexican citizens filled Mexico City's Zócalo to welcome the March for Peace with Justice and Dignity, arriving after a 5-day journey on foot from Cuernavaca, Morelos. Those marching were the families and friends of victims claimed by Mexico's drug war. The peace marchers demanded an end to criminal impunity and justice for their dad, but their chief demand was for then-President Felipe Calderón to bring his misbegotten policy of war against northern cartel leaders to an end, asking instead that President Calderón enter into peace negotiations with the cartels in order to reestablish the country's security. Calderón responded by saying that while he was happy to enter into a dialogue with the good people of the peace movement, he would never enter into peace negotiations with, quote, esos bárbaros del norte. Though separated by over a century, Calderón's speech act linked 21st century narcos with the 19th century Apache and Comanche through historical allusion, as these equestrian tribes were the original Bárbaros del Norte, who had successfully waged war between 1830 and 1870 against the Mexican state in an effort to expand their own territories. The Mexico City Peace March was led by Javier Cecilia, a poet and journalist whose 24-year-old son, Juan Francisco, was killed with 6 friends by a group of sicarios on March 28th of the same year. These young men were killed because they had unwittingly gotten into a bar fight with nephews of a sicario who worked for the Pacifico Sur cartel. These nephews appealed to their uncle for revenge, and he obliged. The torture and murder of these upper-crust university students and a businessman, one of whom was the son of the renowned poet Javier Cecilia, brought into cruel relief the truth about Calderón's war against the cartels. Of the more than 60,000 dead, and that's a conservative estimate, of the more than 60,000 dead as a consequence of Calderón's war, a significant number, if not the majority, were innocent bystanders caught up in the crossfire or swept up in the escalating violence of its perpetrators. Calderón's administration repeatedly portrayed all those kills as members of the cartel or as delinquents whose choice of lifestyle had inevitably led to their death. These participants in the March for Peace, carrying placards of their dead around their neck, made it all too evident that this was not the case. Instead of hardened drug dealers or strung-out junkies, the marchers told of students who were killed on their way to university, working-class men and women who were killed on their way to their jobs, and indigenous peasants who were killed for protecting their fields. These two speech acts, Obama's and Calderón's, separated by only a matter of days, foregrounded the transnational histories of war against the Apache and the Comanche that link US and Mexican statecraft. Both countries used wars with these equestrian nations, the Indios Bárbaros de la Frontera, to consolidate their own national boundaries. In the early 19th century, the US military enjoined the equestrian nations to raid northern Mexican towns and pueblos for the lucrative trade in horses and captives, thereby preparing the way for the US war against Mexico in 1846. In response, the states of Durango, Coahuila, Nuevo León, and Sonora formed militias and offered generous bounties for the heads or scalps of Apache and Comanche, Seri, and Kiowa warriors, paradoxically protecting northern Mexico against some of its original inhabitants. US mercenaries, runaway slaves, and relocated Northern American Indians joined these posses by the hundreds in exchange for Mexican citizenship and land. Kind of a dream act of the 19th century, if you will. But so did Mexican Indians, who were traditional enemies of these groups and who solidified their enfranchisement in the Mexican nation by committing these inaugural acts of violent belonging. Through these posses and scalping policies, the fledgling nation constituted a distinctly multiracial Mexican citizenry against the threatening backdrop of these Indios Bárbaros. Scalping and beheading were an early form of statecraft for both nations, though, because once war with Mexico ended, the US and Mexican militaries joined forces against the Indios Bárbaros, and finally against Jerónimo and his band of Chiricahua Apache, until this last band, Jerónimos, of savage tribes, was pacified and brought into reservation status at the end of the 19th century, as some of you may know from your history classes. The speech acts of the Navy SEAL to Obama and of Calderon's to the national media not only remind us of this transnational complicity between the two nations, they also demonstrate the afterlife of the Indio Bárbaro, who forever haunts the racial geography of both nations. And indeed, although the genealogy of the Indio Bárbaro, and particularly of the Bárbaro del Norte, can be traced to the specific geography of what is today the US Southwest, as a concept metaphor for a foreign agent threatening God and country, it has traveled far afield from this original homeland. Heterotemporal and multispatial, the Indio Bárbaro / Savage Apache has migrated to the present-day Middle East, to central Mexico and to Central America, signaling again and again a threat at the very heart of the nation and presaging the need for ever greater militarization of the US and Mexico's southern borders in the 21st century. Indeed, these speech acts conjoin the Muslim terrorist and the narco-terrorist in the national imaginations of both countries as dangers that once again require the joint action of the US and Mexican-American militaries, and Mexican-American, that would be funny, and Mexican militaries to keep the borders of both nations safe. I suggest that a racial unconscious expresses itself in the contemporary iterations of the conjoined boogeymen who together putatively threaten free and democratic nations. As I argue in Indian given racial geographies across Mexico and the United States, the figure of the Indian has a deep genealogy in the Spanish and British colonial archive, one that produced rather distinct articulations of the racial nations in Mexico and the US. Indian given, I mean, just think about the fact that we think of indigenous peoples in the United States as sovereign nations, but in Mexico, you think of the indigenous peoples as completely part of Mexico, as one with Mexico. I mean, just, you know, in your own travels, you might have encountered this. I analyzed constitutive moments in colonial and national history from the period of 1550 to 2014 to demonstrate how indigenous identity came to mean such different things in the United States and Mexico as a consequence of these distinct legacies of British and Spanish colonial governmentality and geographic representations of indigenous peoples. While the contemporary racial geographies of Mexico and the United States vary significantly today, particularly with regard to the representation of their indigenous constituents, I nevertheless argue in Indian Given that during the height of liberal nation-making in the 19th century, both countries were complicit in producing the Indio Bárbaro of the borderlands. These nations, first separately and then together, contrived the figure of the Indio Bárbaro for the purposes of solidifying imperial nationalisms. Though the U.S. won the war of expansion against Mexico, both nations triumphed in the end over the original inhabitants of the region. To clarify, Indio Bárbaro is not representative. The Indio is not a reflection of actual Comanche or Apache involved in their own wars against the U.S. and Mexico. Rather, it's precisely the catacretic nature of the Indio Bárbaro that accounts for its long afterlives. Untethered from any referent, the Indio Bárbaro floats across time and space, conditioning our repetitive futures. I'm not making a historical argument suggesting a causal relationship between the figure of the 19th century Indio Bárbaro and the Muslim or narco-terrorist of the present. Instead, I'm suggesting that the Indio Bárbaro inhabits the racial unconscious of both countries. Repressed but always present, the Indio Bárbaro conditions our national responses to contemporary phenomena, functioning as an unconscious racial hermeneutic in the business of statecraft. This explains why it's so easy for Trump to summon the figure of the Mexican bad hombre, who rapes and pillages across the landscape from our citizenship's unconscious. It's why Trump persuaded 40% of the U.S. population that 11 million exploited and unauthorized Mexican workers in this country are the true cause of economic stagnation and working class suffering. Moreover, it explains his only job strategy to date, which is that of adding 15,000 ICE and Border Patrol agents to protect us from the Mexicans, which will in turn produce jobs through the boom required in the prison industry in building detention centers to house these immigrants awaiting deportation. Remember that moment so close and so recently when we were thinking about closing prisons? Well, now we don't have to, right? Because we have this new president and we also have the need to house all of these immigrants that are suddenly criminal aliens and must be put in prison before they're deported. So once again, the Indio Bárbaro is approached as a military threat, and although the Mexican government is currently freaking out about the return of the 11 million Mexicans, though they're thrilled about the 800 DACA recipients, I hope this talk will explain how the Mexican governments have continually participated in the production of the Indio Bárbaro as such. So I'm going to give a little bit of a description of the book, and then I'm going to of the book as a whole, and then I'm going to talk about the narcos today. So Indian Given provides an interdisciplinary comparison of racial geographies that were put in place by Spanish colonialism in New Spain and British colonialism in England, tracing the figure of the Indian as he emerged in the colonial record to solidify distinctly Eurocentric models of universal humanity that were based respectively on Catholic and Protestant Enlightenment principles. I follow his function, material and rhetorical, in the expansion of the colonial empires onto the northern frontier of New Spain and the western frontier of Anglo-America. I consider his centrality not only in the consolidation of Mexican and U.S. national imaginaries, but also his actual participation in the wars over national boundaries in the mid to late 19th century. I then follow this figure's progress into the 20th century, from the early 20th revolutionary mestizaje in Mexico and the Jim Crow segregation in the United States, through the 20th century promulgation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, with its proliferation of capital, immigrants, and narco economies. And again, another big frustration, I should have called up Hillary and said, I know a lot about NAFTA and immigration, you should have me on board. Because it was absolutely no surprise to me that he kept invoking NAFTA, because NAFTA was devastating to working class peoples on both sides of the border. And who brought us NAFTA? Clinton. Well, Bush and Clinton, we shouldn't put it on Clinton, but the first Clinton brought us NAFTA. Right? So there is this way in which people weren't wrong in blaming Hillary for everything her husband did, right? Although he didn't do it alone, obviously he did it with the Republican Congress. Anyway, so I toggle back and forth between the historical role played by particular Indian groups like the Apache, the Comanche, and the Pueblo, the philosophical role played by the ontological Indian as a category for Catholic and Protestant Enlightenment humanism, and the tropological role played by the figure of the Indian in facilitating the geopolitical formation of European empires and American imperial nationalisms like the US and Mexico, but you can include Canada as well. In other words, my argument is concerned with how indigenous peoples and representations of indigenous peoples combine to construct the actual maps of Mexico and the United States as landscapes of the border zone. Okay, so narco and Muslim terrorists are regularly brought together by government officials to justify defense budgets on the basis of their presumed joint threat. But the figure of the it's the figure of the Indio Barbaro that ultimately enables this threat to cohere. State Department and Pentagon officials, for example, routinely testify before Congress that drug trafficking threatens U.S. national security because profits could potentially fund jihadist terrorist organizations. This connection may strike some of us as improbable, given that Latin American drug lords are often explicit in their Christian devotion and notorious for their conservative politics. Nevertheless, this line of argumentation precedes 9/11, as both Reagan and Clinton administrations signed executive orders that strengthened joint anti-drug and anti-terrorist enforcement. And I'm originally from Laredo, Texas, and I can't tell you the number of times I've screamed at my sheriff in the H-E-B grocery store saying, like, stop lying to people and telling them that, you know, that Muslim terrorists are coming over the border because he wants the money. But I went to Catholic high school with him, so I can yell at him. Nevertheless, so the United States has spent over $1 trillion on our war on drugs in Latin America alone since the 1970s, with over 20 billion spent in the last decade alone. Military and police aid to Latin America peaked at $1.6 billion in 2010. With Mexico receiving over $500 million as the top aid recipient that year. While U.S. and military police aid to the region declined under Obama due to tightening budgets, today Latin America receives more yearly military and police aid than it did at any point during the Cold War. So just let that sink in. So more military and police aid for the war on drugs today than ever during the Cold War. And the U.S. spent trillions of dollars on the Cold War, right? So they still receive more today than then. And that's even adjusted for inflation. It's not just, you know, absolute dollars. It's adjusted for inflation. So we have more than 4,000 U.S. military troops on the ground in Latin America at any time, as well as additional agents from at least 10 other law enforcement agencies. There is constant U.S. and naval and Air Force surveillance of the sea and sky as well. Like the Pentagon and the State Department, Homeland Security argues for increased budgets in order to protect the United States from jihadi terrorists and Mexican drug cartels who might mix themselves in with the undocumented immigrants who are crossing the southern border. For this reason, Homeland Security absorbed the Border Patrol, transforming it in the process. Homeland Security has more than doubled the number of Border Patrol agents along the southwest border, from 9,100 in 2001 to more than 18,500 today. That's just the southern border, right? Moreover, Homeland Security has militarized the border with advanced weaponry and surveillance technology as surplus military equipment developed for surveillance and intelligence gathering in Iraq and Afghanistan finds its way to the U.S. and Mexico border. I'm sure you all are aware of this, that we produce all of these things that immediately become obsolete and then they get sold back to our own law enforcement, which the Obama administration actually had put a stop to, but Trump's renewed. But there's no stop to them giving it to Homeland Security, right? So this is the stuff that's used on the border today. So Homeland Security has militarized the border with advanced weaponry and surveillance technology. Oh, I already said that. Drones now patrol drones the entire 2,000-mile southern border of the US at all times. By way of contrast, the Border Patrol has only 2,200 agents on the Canadian border. And that border is 5,500 miles long. So the Canadian border is at least more than twice as long, but nevertheless, it has like a tenth of the agents that are surveilling it. So drones also surveil less than 1,000 of those 5,000 miles, even though it's the Canadian border that 9/11 terrorists breached originally. So the Border Patrol has yet to capture a single jihadist crossing into the United States from Mexico, though our agents kill several Mexican citizens per year, and you may have heard of some of those cases. They kill in the double digits of Mexican citizens per year, including many who were clearly on the Mexican side of the border with no intention of crossing. And as you may have heard, the Supreme Court will decide whether or not Mexicans killed on Mexican soil by U.S. agents on the U.S. side of the border, right? So the U.S. side of the border, the agents on the U.S. side, the Mexicans are on the Mexican side, whether those plaintiffs have jurisdictional right to seek justice in a U.S. court. Right? So night vision goggles, drones, and M16s are all trained on undocumented Mexican immigrants looking for work, but it's the figure of the Indio Barbaro that enables this racial distribution of force. It's not just the generic fear of a brown planet that leads to the militarization of the southern border, but an unconscious yet ever-present fear of the Mexican as the Indio Barbaro, I suggest. Of the Indio Barbaro as foreign terrorist that leads to this disproportionate distribution of resources to protect the U.S. from Mexico's supposed criminal aliens. Just to underscore our national hermeneutic, our racialized national hermeneutic, millions of pounds of marijuana enter the U.S. from Canada every year. And Canada is the leading supplier of ecstasy, often laced with highly addictive methamphetamines. And as I'm sure many of you in the room know, this is the drug of choice for white U.S. citizens between the ages of 19 and 39. And it's a nice drug, so why wouldn't it be? Meanwhile, El Paso is constantly ranked as the safest city in the United States. We have heard so very much from Donald Trump about U.S. citizens losing their jobs to factories relocated to Mexico. But the irony is that the millions of Mexicans who crossed the border since 1994 have done so because they lost their jobs as a consequence of NAFTA as well. 2014 marked the 20th anniversary of NAFTA, and as we know, NAFTA required the elimination of all Mexican subsidies to small farmers. With industrially produced basic grains, including corn, flooding the Mexican market from Canada and the United States, 2.5 million farmers were displaced from agricultural production in Mexico by 2005. And as any Latin Americanist in the room may know, or would inform you, when a Mexican farmer abandons his farm, it has a multiplying effect, as the farm invariably employs family labor and seasonal itinerant labor. Thus, it should come as no great surprise when by 2004, 10 years after NAFTA, a conservatively estimated 8 million Mexicans had migrated to the United States in search of work. 96% of Mexican municipalities have sent migrants to the U.S. A significant percentage of this migration has been indigenous peoples. And thus, farms across the United States, but especially on the eastern seaboard, on the northeastern seaboard, employ entire communities of indigenous peoples. Chols, Tojolabal, Tzotzil, Celtals from Chiapas, Zapotec and Mixtec from Oaxaca, who in some cases are kept in conditions of debt peonage and indentured servitude on these farms. But peasants are not alone. And I don't know if any of y'all heard the story of this happened in New York on a farm on Long Island when one such indigenous Mexican finally escaped and just like, you know, beat it to the nearest human being, and the entire community, his entire community, which had come recruited as a community to work on this farm in Long Island, New York, right, had been held basically prisoner, right, until this intrepid man escaped. Anyway, so Peasants are not alone, as Mexicans have also abandoned urban centers because Mexico is deindustrializing as an effect of NAFTA. I know, Mexico is deindustrializing, not just the United States. It's very complicated. You can take my class. NAFTA created a little over 500,000 jobs in the Maquiladora industry over the last 25 years. So Mexican exports to the United States have grown accordingly. The value of trade between Mexico and the United States has increased by a factor of 10. US exports to Mexico increased from $41 billion in 1993 to $41 billion in 1993 to $226 billion in 2014, an increase of well over 400%. Mexican exports to the United States, meanwhile, increased from $40 billion in 1993 to $280 billion in 2014, an increase of over 600%. Right, so U.S. exports increased by 400%, U.S. exports to Mexico, and Mexican exports to the United States increased by 600%. This is why Trump's not wrong when he says there's a deficit. There is a deficit, but there's an exponential increase on both sides of the border of exports going back and forth. So it's the wrong optic. In 2016, trade between the two countries exceeded $5 billion, and every day $1.6 billion worth of trade occurs between the two countries, just Mexico and the United States. Indeed, the U.S. is running an import-export deficit with Mexico, causing U.S. blue-collar workers so much stress, as we saw in the election. But while this trade deficit should bode well for Mexico, when one looks more carefully at these statistics, a very different picture emerges. It is true that Mexico exported more value-added goods to the United States today than it did before NAFTA. However, this does not imply an intensification of industrialization in Mexico. Rather, it's having the opposite effects for two reasons. Most of the value added to Mexican exports isn't added in Mexico. As Mexican maquilas perform the very last step in the production process, assembling inputs produced in many other countries into the final product to be shipped to the United States, Mexican maquilas add a tiny percentage of the value added to the commodity. Mexico's increase in value-added exports disguises the fact that the majority of the value added to the product is added outside of Mexico, and consequently leaves very little by way of profit or taxation, or more importantly, technological know-how, because that's what Mexico is after in these kinds of agreements, technological know-how. But it's the flood of imports in consumer durables from the United States and Canada that's destroying Mexico's domestic industry. Of course, domestic is a quaint term in our neoliberal present, but 25% of Mexico, Oh, it's because it's back and forth now. Okay, 25% of Mexico's domestic industries have had to shutter their factory doors because they simply cannot compete with goods that were produced transnationally under the flexible production schemes at rock-bottom prices. When these kinds of factories close, the kinds of factories that produce a blender or a refrigerator or a dishwasher, which Mexico was producing before NAFTA, when these kinds of factories close, it's particularly devastating on an economy because their supply chains and distribution chains are entirely domestic. That is composed of Mexican capital and Mexican imports, employing domestic labor. It's also the domestic industry that absorbs skilled labor and produces domestic technological innovation. Right? So in other words, before, if you were building a car, well, they never built, well, yeah, no, let's say they were building the Volkswagen, which they built, you know, they were also building the tire. They were also building the windshield wiper. They were also building the clutch. All of that is embodied technological know-how, right? But when you start just having Mexico be the final stage in assembling something where every component has been produced at the rock bottom price in some other part of the country, or other part of the world, then you've ended up losing actually more factory work than you've gained. or you've lost as much as you've gained at least. So maquiladoras, by contrast, maquiladoras, which is what they have gained a lot of, are highly parasitical. Almost all inputs that go into the production process used by the factory and the technology these inputs embodied are imported into Mexico for maquiladoras along the border, which I'm sure you've heard of. Thus, unlike the domestic factories that produce for domestic consumption, factories that produce, maquiladoras leave no technological know-how behind, nor do they create the forward and backward linkages that multiply economic growth within a country. While it is true that maquilas pay much more than Mexico's daily minimum wage, it is also true that maquiladoras pay less than domestic unionized industry, right? So they pay less than domestic factories. Thus, the increase in overall wages due to maquiladoras is more than offset by the decline in wages due to the closing of domestic factories that cannot compete with imports. So for the Mexican economist Raúl Weiss Delgado, NAFTA, and particularly the maquila industry it enabled, have cheapened Mexican labor power dramatically by de-skilling jobs and by eliminating other avenues of employment. Maquilas are a form of exporting labor without it's because the two words are true, exploiting and exporting. So maquilas are a form of exporting labor without exporting the laborer, is what he argues. Moreover, they draw millions of Mexicans from the interior to the border region, converting them into this huge reserve of impoverished laborers who drive down wages along the border. And I believe you see just one of the ways in which NAFTA has fueled the drug economy by providing a proletariat desperate and ready for employment along the border. But NAFTA enables the drug economy in other significant ways. The tremendous increase in commodities flowing across the border makes it much, much easier to move drugs. Only 2% of the cargo crossing the border ever gets inspected, ever, right? And I'm actually kind of glad I didn't know that when I was growing up in Laredo, because you might have been looking up La Reina del Norte and not just La Reina del Sur, you know. But to inspect any more than 2% of the cargo would cause huge bottlenecks, slow down production time, and lead to spoilage, and you wouldn't have your avocado toast. The other way in which free trade facilitates the drug trade is that it has also made it significantly easier to launder money. U.S. foreign direct investment in Mexico between 1989 and 1993 averaged $4.3 billion per year. In 2012, that figure ballooned to over $100 billion. It's ridiculously easy to repatriate payments to drug cartels as foreign direct investment, in other words. And it's extremely difficult to keep drug capital and all other capital apart. Thus, every year, and I think this is really hilarious, every year the Mexican banking system has an average of $10 billion that it cannot account for through GDP, remittances from the United States, or petroleum exports, right? Because, of course, they keep accounting. They have accounting like we have here, you know, and there's just $10 billion they can't even account for, and we know where it comes from. So NAFTA set millions of Mexicans in motion looking for work from the countryside to the city, from the cities to the maquiladoras on the border, from the maquiladoras to the United States. This new geography of globalization, a geography of motion that has emptied the countryside and filled up urbanized spaces in Mexico and the United States, but also in Central America and the Caribbean. It's a racial geography of neoliberalism that has displaced indigenous peoples on a massive scale and is transforming the democratic makeup of the United States. Do you know what the second most spoken indigenous language is in the United States? Anybody? Anybody? Do you know what the first one is? Navajo. Do you know what the second one is? Zapotec. Yeah, so there are more Zapotec-speaking indigenous peoples. They're like the second most spoken language, indigenous language. So, NAFTA has created a precarious life for the vast majority of Mexicans, and thus it should surprise no one that a portion of this vulnerable population would choose to migrate north to take up jobs that proliferate in the increasingly gentrified and wealthy cities of the United States. But it should surprise us even less that a portion of this vulnerable young population chooses to take up lucrative careers in the drug economy that thrives in the shadow of NAFTA. Arguably, like the Apache and the Comanche before them, these drug dealers facilitate an illicit trade in goods that are sought after by a gluttonous U.S. citizenry. In the 19th century, the Apache and the Comanche raided Mexican ranches for horses, cattle, and captives that fetched a dear price from European settlers in this territory, in Oklahoma, right? But in the Midwest, from European settlers and also from dislocated eastern indigenous peoples pouring into the Great Plains, into Indian Territory, as it was then called. But today, these narcotraficantes bring us cocaine, heroin, and marijuana from the factories in Colombia and the fields of Mexico that fetch a dear price from the casual users and the junkies that are proliferating in U.S. suburbs and cities alike. Rather than recognizing these narcos as model entrepreneurs responding to the laws of supply and demand, our demand to be specific, we instead vilify them using the same language and tropes that were used against the Indios Bárbaros del Norte in the 19th century. Narcos are aberrations in humanity, engaging in improper trade with improper methods, who should be excised from the borderlands at all costs, requiring the joint efforts of the US and Mexican military to do so. For the Mexican bourgeoisie, the narcos son unas bestias que no merecen ser parte de la nación y de la humanidad. They're beasts that shouldn't be part of the nation or of humanity. And just as the US does not negotiate with terrorists, Mexican presidents do not negotiate with barbarians. For half of the US electorate, the Mexican immigrant is also engaging in improper trade with improper methods and should be excised from the U.S. nation at all costs. These migrants trade themselves, smuggling their cheapened labor across the border at great cost to their personal safety. And of course, every Mexican immigrant looking for work is potentially a bad hombre, looking for his next victim. And thus Trump wins by promising to extend a 700-mile wall that already covers 1/3 of the border between the US and Mexico. Here, the old racial geography of the borderlands informs the new, as a simplistic explanation of the economic restructuring brought upon the US, both countries, by NAFTA and the drug economy that it enables. Once again, I want to remind you that I'm going to present some disturbing images, and you should look away at this point if you don't want to. If one enters narco beheadings into any search engine, tens of thousands of defiled corpses fill one screen. Beheaded corpses, scalped corpses, dismembered corpses, corpses with their eyes gouged out, or with the Z of the Zeta cartel carved in their torsos and backs. Corpses come with notes pinned to their chest with a knife or written on the body with a marker, explaining the offense, explaining the offense that led to such a terrible death. One might imagine that these corpses are beheaded to prevent identification. One would be wrong, as the head is not removed from the scene, but rather cleverly arranged to punctuate it. Two skulls are cradled, in one photo, in this photo, two skulls are cradled by firearms, two skulls are cradled by forearms with hands, their corresponding scalps delicately placed above the scene on the railing of a bridge. To ensure identification, the accompanying sign informs us that these two are El Chino and El Fantasma, and lists their crimes against the cartel. In another photo, 4 heads are arranged in a row along the windshield of a car that reads, quote, Última letra captura y ejecuta a asesinos devastadores. The head of the ultimate letter, the last letter, the Zetas, kill those who assassinate and execute and assassinate the population. The hood of the car directly in front of the skulls reads Zzz, a pun on the name of the executioner to suggest these 4 men, all with their eyes closed, are just sleeping. In another photograph, 2 corpses lean up against each other on the street corner, their heads completely flayed. They have been arranged to look like 2 drunks sleeping it off, with cigarettes hanging from their lipless teeth, and with ridiculous sombreros atop their bald skulls. The cartel's parodying a parody of the lazy Mexican. Perhaps their crime was not working hard enough to secure the expected rate of return, or perhaps they used too much of the product themselves. There is no helpful caption explaining their deaths. What is made clear in these photographs is that these executions are public events. They are not private adjudications of crime syndicates, but the public policing of a population. Indeed, in several of the photos, there are crowds surrounding the scene of the execution. And you can see, all the feet and the bicycles on the top of that. The narcos upload real-time photographs of their crimes themselves from their cell phones. These staged scenes of performative violence / justice are not only directed at local communities intimidated into submission, but to the entire world that has access to the internet. They connote a spectacular and absolute form of territorial justice, established precisely because it, quote, pursues the body beyond all possible pain. These narrative scenes send the parameter in script and blood and in body parts of what happens should you violate the narco law. Thus, this kind of death is not limited to cartel cadre, but illustrative of a general, if unwritten code of behavior that must be followed by everyone within the cartel territory. In another photograph, 7 men are arranged in a semicircle on a main rotary in Uruapan, Michoacan. They sit on plastic chairs, their eyes covered, their bodies showing no visible signs of torture, a merciful death. Attached to several of the corpses' chests with knives are posters that read, Advertencia, esto le va a pasar a todos los asaltantes, rateros de coches, casa, habitación y trausentes, así como secuestradores, violadores, extorsionistas. Attention, this is what will happen to all of those of you who are robbing houses or kidnapping or stealing or extorting. So the cartels claim exclusive power to inflict violence as punishment in their system of justice, prohibiting others from the actions that are their sole purview, but also establishing the cartel as the protector of the civilian population from common criminals. Another performative scene establishes the parameter of permissible speech within the realm. In September of 2011, a group of 3 social media activists were killed in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, for reporting on Zeta violence to the city. With over 80 journalists killed or disappeared during the Calderon presidency, Nuevo Laredo journalists had understandably stopped reporting on cartel activities. Filling the void were 3 young bloggers, including La Nena de Laredo, Maria Elizabeth Macias, who informed the public on where shootouts were transpiring, who was targeted and why, and how to evade their checkpoints, the narcos checkpoints. 2 were strung from a pedestrian bridge in Nuevo Laredo, 1 disemboweled and hog-tied, the others armed, severed, and hung by his feet. The most spectacular assassination of all was reserved for Macias, who was suspected of providing information to the Attorney General and the Mexican military, passed on to her by her internet fans. La Nena's decapitated body was found in Nuevo Laredo's Zócalo, partially undressed to show that the skin on her back had been flayed and to suggest that she had been raped. Her head was mounted on a large spherical sculpture in the plaza. Her keyboard was arranged to hang around what would have been her neck, and her mouth was put in her mouth. The poster accompanying her body conveyed the following. Ok, Nuevo Laredo, en vivo y redes sociales. Yo soy la nena de Laredo y aquí estoy por mis reportes y los suyos. Para los que no quieren creer, esto me pasó por mis acciones, por confiar en Serena y Marina. Gracias por su ascensión, la nena de Laredo. And again, the C's. So she's saying, so just in case you don't believe it, this is what happened to me for participating for being a blogger and passing news on to the Attorney General. Macias' courageous voice was silenced by the Zetas that assassinated her, as is emblemized by her mouse shoved in her mouth. Yet the Zetas usurp her speech when they write the attached note in first person, ventriloquizing her voice to articulate the law, their punishment pursuing her body beyond the point of death. She speaks in blood and print on their behalf to silence any future political speech. After these scenes of narco-violence, of violence that pursues the victims beyond death, with the torture and defilement of the body, it is so easy to say, "Qué bárbaro." It's even easier to avert our eyes, to turn away, to refuse to see. And yet these scenes of violence that are staged in parks, on rotaries and bridges, at the entrances of town, demand that bystanders look and understand the power they convey. These spectacular displays public displays are a modern form of statecraft, in that they are a mode of taking possession of the sovereignty of the state in a Foucauldian sense. The perpetrators of this violence decide who dies, but they also decide who lives and how they should live. These scenes of violence are a management technique, setting the parameters of media representation, of acting as a deterrent to petty crime. They denote a territorial control of one's market and establish the boundaries of acceptable political belonging. Just in case we are tempted to say that this kind of violence is proof positive that Mexico has become ungovernable, let us remember the events of September 2014 in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, where 43 students were disappeared and probably killed for their political protesting. Ayotzinapa is a teachers' college reserved for the children of peasants who are trained as primary, secondary, and high school teachers. The students were protesting tuition hikes and tuition hikes, a tradition for Mexican students who are accustomed to free, absolutely free, higher education. They were also demanding guaranteed employment after graduation, as budget cuts had severely shrunk the positions available for teachers in rural schools. Given the devastation of small farming in Mexico, rural teachers' colleges arguably provide the only remaining legal avenue to alternative employment for the children of farmers. Evidently, the town mayor did not like the fact that the students were flying in the face of neoliberal restructuring and demanding that the state provide employment and education. Or perhaps he did not like the fact that alternative employment threatened to threatened the pool of labor reserved for the drug economy from which he benefited directly. Whatever the case may be, he ordered the local police to kidnap the students and hand them over to the cartel, presumably so that they might be killed, and the police followed their orders. I bring this case again to our attention, not to demonstrate the lawlessness of Mexico, but rather to underscore that the drug economy is the new law. It not only provides new sources of employment, but these deaths make evident that political and economic power are still won in Mexico. With the drug economy comes a new form of governmentality, practicing institutionalized forms of violence carried out jointly by the local police, national military officers who covered up the crime afterwards, and cartel henchmen to defend the territorial boundaries and political interests of the cartels and their allies in official government positions. This would be the moment to remind us that it was the state governments of Sonora, Coahuila, Durango, and Nuevo León that established beheading and scalping as a form of modern statecraft in the 19th century. After establishing their bounty programs, all 4 states set up commissions to check the scalps and heads brought to the state treasuries for payment. These commissions checked for the distinguishing tattoo patterns and head shavings used by equestrian nations, although, of course, there was no way to ascertain whether the dead were, in fact, participants of raiding parties. Towns in these states regularly held parades to welcome the returning posses, where bounty hunters prominently displayed the scalps and heads and regalia of the dead. It would be easy to end here, implying that Mexico's history of war against the northern indigenous peoples haunts the scenes of narco violence. And this wouldn't be entirely incorrect, as the narcos clearly borrow a familiar lexicon of state-making in their staged and spectacular displays of their enemies. However, this would be an incorrect conclusion, as it would wrongly trace the source of all of this violence to the ever-present, if suppressed, figure of the Indio Bárbaro del Norte. Instead, as in all things, if one wants to get to the heart of the matter, one should follow the money, as Javier Cecilia's peace movement did in 2012. That year, the peace movement that quickly sprang up around Miss Cecilia's deeply personal but broadly representative loss embarked on a 6,000-mile journey, a quote, caravan for peace and justice and a caravan for peace with justice and dignity, end quote, across the United States, bringing attention to their cause and to the need for a negotiated solution to the drug war. The caravan, made up entirely of the families of the killed and the disappeared, stopped at different locations for the functioning of the drug economy and the execution of the drug war. They visited all the major border cities where Mexican imports, including drugs, cross into the United States: San Diego, Nogales, El Paso, Laredo, McAllen. They visited the south side of Chicago to meet the families of those incarcerated for drug-related crimes. They destroyed guns in a Houston parking lot outside of a gun shop to underscore the devastating effect of US manufactured arms that are smuggled into Mexico, as Mexico produces no guns itself, not one. They met with congressional leaders, of course, but they didn't listen. The most moving stop they made was at Fort Benning, the new home of the former School of the Americas. The caravanners staged a die-in in front of the school, reminding the US that the Mexican military, who today carry out the drug war, are trained and armed by the US military. It is not simply that the military accidentally kills innocent bystanders in persecuting drug lords and their underlings, although there is an inordinate amount of collateral damage at the hands of the Mexican military. It is that the Mexican military, trained by the US in the most advanced killing and counterinsurgency techniques, often switch sides in the drug war, lured by the large sums of easy money. Indeed, the most notorious drug cartel of them all, Los Zetas, and most of the examples of violence I showed you were performed by Los Zetas, the Zs, were originally an army battalion of Mexican special forces trained by the US at the School of the Americas in counterinsurgency tactics and, wait for it, drug interdiction. They initially defected to work for the Gulf Cartel in the 1990s as a battalion. The whole battalion defected. During Calderon's drug war, in response to the power vacuum created by the successful arrest and extradition of the leaders of the Gulf Cartel, the Zetas branched out on their own. They are the largest cartel in territory, employing the most brutal tactics in killing. Allegedly, they introduced the practices of beheading and scalping as a form of terror and intimidation. As the peace activists remind us, however, los asesinos no nacen, se hacen aquí. Assassins aren't born, they are made here. Narcos are not born as the contemporary iteration of the Indio Bárbaro, as both President Trump and President Peña Nieto would like us to believe. Narcos are made out of the political and economic conjunction of free trade and drug trade. And so I would like to end by suggesting that perhaps the true Bárbaros del Norte reside at Fort Benning. Thank you. So I can take my own questions, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you, Josie. That was really profound. The piece of it that I wonder about that you're not touching in this is another form of fugitivity, which is slave fugitivity. And I wonder, because Indians in the Latin American case and also in the North American case were intended to be enclosed, right? They're intended to be reduced and contained. And the Indian Bárbaros were the ones who couldn't be contained. But there are other types of fugitives, and I wonder how you think about blackness
I do in the book have I do talk about Afro-Mestizos and because Afro-Mestizos are actually 20 to 40% of the settlers in what was then northern Mexico and stayed in Southwest. They actually are the settlers of those towns. They leave central Mexico because, as you know, there's a very rigid caste system in central Mexico. But when they go out to the borderlands, they're able to exercise different jobs that they would have been limited to do in central Mexico. They're able to have land. That's a very big one, right? They're able to get land on the borderline, on the border zones that they're actually not. Houses aren't allowed to only have land in the central part of Mexico. So I do touch upon it, and I do talk a little bit more about the way in which, in the chapter on the beheadings in the 19th century and the scalping posses, it was actually a very big lure. They very consciously lure or advertise for enslaved black people to come to northern Mexico where they would immediately be set free, right? Because as of 1829, there is no more slavery in Mexico. And so that's part of, I was joking when I said a dream act, but not really, because it really is. It's like, well, come. Also indigenous groups that found themselves on the US side of the border are also asked to come over. It makes a big difference after 1848, because in 1848, when the US takes over a third of Mexico, the threat of being enslaved again is very real. And so you actually have an exodus of the Afro-Mestizos because there isn't actually a way of guaranteeing their freedom, and there definitely is not a way of guaranteeing that they'll get to keep their property, right? Once it becomes very clear that the US is not going to honor the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which included very specifically saying all Mexican citizens who are annexed must be treated as full citizens of the United States. That included indigenous people, that included Afro-Mestizos, that included the recently freed slaves. But of course, that very quickly it becomes very evident that that's not going to happen. But it is primarily about indigenous people, so I do speak about it, but really just kind of as trying to complete the story, but not so much as what the figure of Afro-Mestizos might contribute to the India Bible, which probably I should have done, but I did do. I want to just say one thing, because so many of you are so young and you have the rest of your lives ahead of you. 20 years ago, actually, what am I saying? 10 years ago, 7 years ago, whenever I wouldn't have imagined that gay marriage was a possibility that people would be recognized. I mean, anybody over, I guess, 20, over 30, let's just say, remembers when that seemed like absolutely impossible. So I just want you all to know that it's not impossible to end the drug war, right? It's not impossible, right? If it seems impossible to legalize drugs, it isn't. The ex-Catholic president, the president of the Catholic Party before Calderon was Vicente Fox, and he's going around and talking to anybody who will listen to him, trying to convince the Mexican government and the US government to legalize drugs, to legalize pot and to legalize poppies, right? Because poppies are what you make opium from, right? Which we make heroin from. It's possible to legalize these drugs, and it can happen in your lifetime. Just like I'm so inspired by what happened in Florida, because that's the generation that's going to end, that's going to bring us, real arms gun control. And in a similar way, you can end this violence. I saw Cecilia talk at CUNY, and they brought him together with ex-incarcerated people who had left prison and had been in prison for drugs. And they were telling their stories, and I saw drug dealers, like tough drug dealers, weeping and saying they would never do this again because they had no idea. They don't know where the product they're selling is coming from. They don't know like the kinds of the loss of life that's happening on the other side of the border. I mean, thank God we do have a sense of the way in which imprisonment in this country is used as another form of enslavement. But that drug, all the war against drug users in the United States, it has its counterpart in Latin America, right? People don't know those effects. So
If you all change the policies about drug consumption, that will end. You know, it's like it's already happened around marijuana in states like California, like the price has dropped, the profit margin is leaving, you know what I mean? And so a lot of the reason why they do this, like when I started researching this so many moons ago, like literally like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I thought, oh, it's just that they don't pay the cops enough. It's just that they don't pay the military enough. No government on earth can afford to pay dirty cops $10,000 a week. Right? No, who can, you know, we would all be cops. You know, if somebody could afford to pay you a bribe of $10,000 a week, you'd be in the dark jails too. You know? And this is one of the best kept secrets in this country. And it's like, you think there aren't super corrupt Border Patrol agents that are just waving those drugs through? Of course there's super corrupt Border agents, you know? I love telling the story about my, you know, because I'm from Laredo, all my family's in Laredo. And you know, and one of my friends from high school lives in the valley, and she's a Border Patrol agent. And she's like, I'm a Border Patrol agent, I know how much I make. And I know that that guy that's also a Border Patrol agent cannot afford that boat, cannot afford that Lexus, you know, so it's like, I know something's crooked, but you know, she's not reporting it, and I don't blame her because she's afraid too. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just like, they're able, because of the amount of profit involved in selling these drugs illicitly, they are able to pay everybody this amount of money, you know? But like people are finding in California and Colorado, if you legalize marijuana, all of, you know, the prices come down, and also you've got this incredible new tax base, right? Which they can't put in banks because it's, but you know, nevertheless, you get this incredible tax base. So, you know, it's a depressing talk, but don't be depressed, because in 10 years from now, I want to wake up and see that the Supreme Court has legalized international trade in marijuana and opium. And I expect that to get on it. And I mean, I would throw in cocaine, but that's probably the hardest one to do. But it's not good policy, and all of the experts know this. All of the experts. It's not hard to write this book. It's not hard to write this part of the book. The other parts of the book are really hard. The easiest part of the book to write is this, because in 1992, agricultural economists were warning the negotiators of NAFTA that the agricultural part of NAFTA was going to lead to what they called an immigration hump. Right? This was in 1992. They estimated the immigration hump would be 4 million people. And it's exactly the things I've told you. It's like if you open the market to corn, if you open the market to sorghum, if you open, you know, you're going to destroy the base of all of southern Mexico's agriculture, right? Which was subsidized. The Mexican government set a price for corn and a price for coffee that was above what the international market was. But it served the function of maintaining, not just maintaining unproductive mills of producing corn, of maintaining corn at its origin, right? Of maintaining the, I don't know how many, 50 different kinds of corn that corn producers produced at its origin, right? Now, they have to have seed banks where they're saving all the different varieties of corn because corn production in Mexico is not happening, right? So they have to have these banks in the hope that someday, maybe once again, we'll have farmers who produce, you know, their own corn. And even though my cousins in Mexico are like, why does this corn all taste the same? They still buy the cheap corn, right? They don't buy the corn that's more expensive that's from Mexico because they're on the budget too, right? So they've got cheap corn that's important. Anyway, I was just filling the time so you might have some questions or have, you know, that you think about some questions you might want to ask.
So, Josie, what about your hope towards the racialization that the Indio Barbaro implies? Where does that lie? Because in your book you talk about
I don't know about that.
The psychic trauma. Yeah. Even we see it now, the reiteration of like our president saying, you know, on public television that a judge can't do his job because he's Mexican. You know, that there's all these echoes of this Indio Barbaro in that discourse as well. So, and in your book, you trace it to, you trace this lineage of the Indio Barbaro and its impact in literature, these characters, for instance, and the psychic impact that this rejection of the Indio Barbaro has on his life on both sides of the border. So I wonder if you see a hope maybe in Chicano literature
literature, Chicana literature more specifically, as sort of engaging with indigeneity, and thinking of, and I've read this with my students just got done reading, how the main protagonist, does engage with and accept her indigenous heritage. How do you see any movement toward that sort of decolonial direction? I mean, in terms of Chicano literature, I actually think that it is a good thing to work out, because a part of the book, which I did present on, talks about how Mexicans were legally required to deny their indigenous heritage, because the way in which the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was enforced was that only white Mexicans would be able to vote, hold office, or keep their land. That was the other chapter I was going to give, but I thought this might be a little bit more exciting. So it was actually legally, the way in which the Constitution, the treaty was applied, not the way it was written, required people to denounce their indigenous side. And that's why you have so many Mexicans who might have a sense that they're ancestrally indigenous, but they can't trace it because, their parents at some point along the line made the choice that they were going to be Mexican, white, try to pass as white Mexicans rather than be indigenous. So in terms of the literary, the way in which, not even just the literary, but the filmic or literary ways of reimagining, capturing that indigeneity, I actually think that all of those ways are really productive for processing the trauma of having been asked to reject our indigenous heritage. When it's like, as our mothers would say, pero tienen nopal en la frente, you've got the cactus on your forehead, why are you trying to tell me that, that person isn't indigenous, or however. It's meant in a derogatory way in Mexican Spanish, but, the point is, it's like, anyone who's been to Mexico can see that it's an indigenous nation. But even in Mexico, the vast majority of people, though they might be, completely descended from indigenous people, call themselves mestizos, right, or think of themselves as mestizos. So I think any recuperation of that in the literary and the film, that's doing a kind of psychic healing, and I'm not gonna harsh on anyone's mellow, it's like, if that's what you got, that's not necessarily, what I'm going to do if I ever write that novel. But, that is, it's an understandable way of working through pain. So I actually, and I'll tell you what taught me this, because I used to be a big critic of Gloria Anzaldo. I don't know if y'all know Gloria Anzaldo. Huge critic. And one time I was teaching her La Prieta essay, and that essay she talks about how painful her whole life has been with her own family discriminating against her because she was dark-skinned, and all the things that they said to her, and all the ways in which they treated her, and it's this really moving essay. But I'm a professor, I'm supposed to have a critique, and she uses indigeneity in this really funky way. And so I get up to give my lecture, but I say, well, let's start out with what are people's reactions. That's what one does. And it was an African-American football player in the back row stands up and is weeping because Gloria Anzaldo has finally given him a way of understanding his own personal experience. And you know what I did? I took that lecture and I was like, oh, well, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to critique her at this point. Because suddenly in that moment it was like, bing, who cares? Who cares how she's using indigeneity incorrectly? This is moving people to a greater understanding of their own psychic trauma in a very, racist society. So I was like, that really changed my whole approach to it. Now, will it leave the American unconscious, the US racial unconscious? I don't know. I wasn't hopeful about gay marriage, and I was surprised. There's so many things that surprised me. Like, who expected those kids in Florida to be like, that's it, we call BS? That really, there's these moments in which something happens, and we realize, like, oh, maybe we are doing our jobs well. Maybe we are, bastions of liberalism, and we're actually teaching students the history of this country and other ways of thinking about difference, So, I don't know what, it's been with us so many centuries, but, oh.
Josie, great talk. So I'm wondering, because a lot of my students are here and they're learning about citizenship and indigeneity and the kind of racialization of Mexicans and Latinos more broadly. And I think you're hitting on all these great themes that make me think about this kind of indigenous denial or on the part of a kind of Mexican state project that has all these long, it's obviously like centuries long, but then it almost like clashes or morphs with U.S. imperialism, right? With the Treaty of Guadalupe and U.S. conquest of half of Mexico. And so I'm wondering how if your analysis extends to, I guess, like U.S. law of the way court systems have racialized Mexicans throughout the
that was the other chapter. I was going to talk about it again, but I didn't do that. It's in chapter 4.
Okay.
And it does look at the way in which, well, because the history of Mexicans in this country is really weird. There are only, I mean, as all of you know, after the Civil War, the U.S. passes an amendment that says only whites and descendants of descendants of Africans can naturalize, right? Can become U.S. citizens. So, and it's not just by chance. Like they, in the debates in Congress, they actively land on this language, and part of the reason they landed on this language is to exclude, at that time, primarily Asian Americans. So, I mean, Asians, right, who are coming to the country to work on all sorts of, you know, the railroads and also, and are trying to get citizenship, and they're not. Asian Americans really super broadly conceived. And so, what are those cases called? The cases actually have a name. So there's all of these cases taken by all of these different ethnic and racial groups to be allowed to be naturalized as whites, right? So they're arguing we're white and therefore we should be able to naturalize, right? Also, right? So, you know, Asian Americans, many Asian groups. Oh, what are their names? There's a name. These groups are known because all of these different cases can be grouped together in this kind of case. And the only ones that ever get an affirmative decision that yes, you're white, right? Everybody else is like, no, you're crazy, you're not white, you're not white, you're not white, you're not white. You might actually be Caucasian from the Caucasians and you're still not white, you know? Everybody's not. And of course, only one plaintiff went, I'm black, and I want to be allowed to naturalize. Of course, he lost too, but, you know. Anyway, but it's interesting that in all of those cases, only one decided to take that route. But Mexicans and Armenians. No, right, Karen, isn't that cute? Mexicans and Armenians. Are declared white. And Mexicans are declared white, but white by treaty, not because we actually are phenotypically white. So the judge in this decision actually says, you know, this guy, Roberto Rodriguez, who's asking to be made a U.S. citizen, has all of the features of the, what does he call it, the coppery red man, you know, the high cheekbones, the aquiline nose, the straight hair, but the treaties say that he is white. And so then I think Mexican Americans are put in a really unique position because legally we're white, but in practice there's all of this discrimination and all of this segregation. And they're so cynical that finally, like, when desegregation happens, they say, oh, well, we put Mexicans with black kids, so the Mexicans are white, you know, so that's desegregation. Like, they're super cynical. Like, school districts are really smart and super cynical, and they do all these machinations. So, it takes a very long time, and then, of course, the lawyers have to argue, you're denying us equal due process, and we're white, so you're discriminating. So for a really long time, like the Mexican American law takes this really weird thing where they're trying to prove they're white, right? They're doing other things too. I mean, because that's how lawyers are. They never try just one avenue. And it's not like, you know, LULAC and the NAACP, they're working together. They're trying to get these things desegregated, and they're attacking it from all sides. And then it's not until the 70s that they say, oh no, we're another minority. We're not also white, because that hasn't worked, right? And so, yeah, it's a really interesting case in terms of that's why, you know, and on the other hand, indigenous peoples are made to deny they're Mexican. Like if Pueblo want to be Pueblo and have the rights of the Pueblo, then they can't be Mexican. You know, and so even though all Pueblo, I mean, for those of you who know Pueblo people, you know, they're going to have a Mexican last name, right? Well, a Spanish last name, I suppose we should say, right? You know, but they can't, you know, in order to be Indian, they can't be Mexican, vice versa.
So my question is, how does the figure of the Robin Hood knuckle, like in Chapo, for a lot of people, fit into this narrative that you provided?
Oh, that's a really great question. That's a great question. I mean, I think he is the Robin Hood. I think, I don't know how he fits into the Indio Barbaro, but he does fit into the vacuum that's set by the Mexican state as an effect of the impoverishment of the country through NAFTA. So I do think, like, it's the reason that Chapo is so beloved is because of everything he actually does. But I mean, even in the 19th century, Geronimo was beloved, by until he went crazy and then longer, right? I mean, Geronimo led the Chiricahua Apache, into really bad, death situations, when they finally capitulate there because they're exhausted. But I mean, nevertheless, there were these heroes even back then. So maybe in that way, it's like, they're indios bárbaros from the position of the state, but from the position of the populace, sometimes these indios bárbaros are heroic, right? And they are performing a real service, right? In the sense that they're providing jobs, they're moving product, they're doing economic activity that the region. Yeah, but it's crazy. I'm from Laredo, and I cannot. Everybody in Laredo is like, "Why is Chapo going to escape again?" It's true. It's like, and people really believe Chapo's going to escape. Like they're like, it's just a matter of time. He's working on it. He's working. And I'm like, well, I mean, I kind of actually am with you. But but yeah, I think it's easy to imagine the bandit, the bárbaro from also the position of the hero, depending on where you want. Well, thank you very much.